What year are we in, guys? Am I back to being 7 years old? Because here I am playing Turok Dinosaur Hunter once again. Oh yes! Before we get into our review of Turok on the Switch, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're new here. We do tons of awesome quality Switch content. Let's start with the story. The story for Turok is not one that's obvious from the start. Indeed, the actual story is kept pretty minimalistic, so you probably won't even notice it unless you look it up. You are Turok, a Native American type dude who travels between realms to protect the world or something. There's an evil guy trying to destroy it, and you need to collect artifacts to stop him in his plans. I mean, I would have preferred more storytelling going on during the gameplay, but when you're shooting dinosaurs that have high-tech weaponry, it's not exactly needed here. You don't play Turok for the story, right? The gameplay is classic. It feels very much like the original Doom, which I'm sure was a great inspiration for it. It's shooting mixed with exploration and platforming. The controls definitely feel from that era as your character glides seamlessly, as smooth as butter across the landscape. It feels refreshingly back to basics, from the usual hunking soldier to an almost weightless entity. You feel kind of free. You're tasked with traveling between 7 locations in search of the artifacts that can help you take down the bad guy with 1 piece per level. Levels are big and wide-ranging, but can also be linear at times. In some levels, you'll often be heading down in one straight direction with few distractions along the way, but some can be quite wide-ranging, kind of like maze-type levels. There's great variety here, and there's lots of secrets, teleports, and so on. And sometimes it can be a little difficult to discern where to go next, as the game does not hold your hand at all, which I do actually appreciate. I like the feeling of exploration rather than being told where to go by a waypoint on the map. It's so satisfyingly simple, and the weapons are fun to use. The bow takes a lot of patience and is not always the best in the fight due to its slowness, but get it spot on and you'll feel so good taking out soldiers and dinosaurs with it. You'll soon pick up a shotgun, a machine gun, and all manner of high-tech weaponry that are increasingly awesome, and they all have their own personality and really stand out. It's great when you get a new one and try it out. Believe me, you'll have to try them all, as despite ammo being fairly common, you'll still have to juggle your weapons to ensure you don't run out, mostly thanks to the respawning enemies. And that leads me onto my least favourite aspect of Turok. Very few games can pull off the respawning enemies gimmick successfully, in my opinion. No less a first-person shooter where ammo and health is limited to pickups and potentially at the mercy of RNG as to whether an enemy drops something or not. I really think this mechanic could have been taken out of this re-release without too much criticism from purists. It doesn't add anything to the game, in my opinion, aside from adding to the difficulty slightly, which is adjustable anyways. I suspect many people will also dislike the occasional platforming the game asks you to do. The speedy, breezy nature of the movement really doesn't entirely lend itself well to platforming, especially where depth perception seems a little off oddly. I don't mind it, although I did feel frustration at times. Probably for the time as a 3D first-person shooter, it would have been pretty sound, to be honest. One of the better examples from the era. Still, it hasn't aged perfectly well. The original game was restricted to just one analog stick, which wasn't ideal for a first-person shooter. I believe it had heavy aiming assists, from what I remember, and this remaster still retains that. And considering this has been upgraded to use both analog sticks, this makes hitting your target pretty much guaranteed every time. It's almost too easy to get your shots on target now. In addition to that, you may have heard in my gameplay video that there is gyroscopic aiming in this Switch port of Turok. It's a pleasant surprise and a welcome addition that every shooter must have, in my opinion. Due to the generous nature of the hurt boxes for enemies, it may not be entirely necessary here, at least in the default settings, but crank that sensitivity up a bit higher and you're cooking with gas. What I do like is the amount of options available. You can tweak more things than usual in this port, more than just the difficulty and sound and such. You can change visual effects, the amount of fog, and even gameplay stuff like the head bobbing that goes on. They're not huge tweaks, but I really like that they're here, and I think more games should include smaller, more weird options like these. Overall, gameplay-wise, Turok is still a fun game. It may not have aged perfectly, but its more pure and basic nature may actually be refreshing for some. It still feels good to play and take down the prehistoric creatures. The fact that enemies are omniscient, always knowing where you are and aim perfectly, can be frustrating, as can their respawning nature and some of the platforming segments don't really mesh well with your movement of the character. It's still a fun time though, I can't deny that. Visually, Turok is definitely retaining that classic 64 look with blocky, low poly models. It's not aged particularly well, but I do believe the visual fidelity has been cleaned up somewhat after being unshackled from the Nintendo 64. There is more detail on the models than I remember, and the horrendous fog that plagued the original appears to have been pared back somewhat, but still not completely eradicated. I'm not sure why that is, but just know there is still fog here. Could more have been done? Oh, almost certainly. Whether the developers didn't want to mess with the classic aesthetics too much, or maybe it would have been too much work, I would have liked to have seen more. Apparently there's been a lot of improvements in the effects department, but I can't say I noticed it a whole lot. Nothing really stood out to me. It's an unambitious port that's respectful to the original, that's what I'll say. Performance-wise, you're looking at a very solid 60 frames per second as you would expect. I didn't notice any slowdown at all, but considering I didn't analyze everything with scientific fact that it was perfect throughout, but it did seem like it. It's hardly a major achievement for a game over 20 years old, but it's nice to know it has the performance you would expect. I mean, some enemy animations are lower frame rate, but I think that's just how they were programmed anyway. The game still runs smoothly even if the enemies kind of don't. For those concerned about file size, you don't need to worry. Turok takes up a measly 201 megabytes, which is smaller than things like Wargroove, Tetris 99, and Dead Cells. Although saying that, the original game did manage to fit on an 8 megabyte cartridge, I believe, so it has seen some blow. The audio is classic. I'm probably biased, but I'm so nostalgic for the tense jungle beats that the game has. Due to hardware resources, there's not exactly a stack of tracks going on, and things can get maddeningly repetitive at times, but the music fits the theme so well. Interestingly, in this port, it includes both the Nintendo 64 soundtrack as well as the later PC release, which I didn't realize had a different soundtrack, but it does. As a Nintendo 64 kid though, I've got to have that classic soundtrack on, even if the PC one may be better. I don't know. I didn't care to listen to it too much because who needs something other than the classic? I'm joking, of course, but it's a great choice from the developers to include both. This Nintendo Switch release is coming in at $19.99 in the US, which I think is a tad on the expensive side considering it's not exactly aged the best, nor has there been huge changes. I know I said Final Fantasy IX was great value and that was slightly more expensive, but that game holds up superbly well to this day. Despite still being fun, Turok is a trinket of time, and I think $5 less would have been a sweeter spot for me personally. It's about 8 hours long, as long as you don't get stuck too much, which is a decent length. And I do feel there is some replayability thanks to some fun cheat codes you can find online to play around with stuff like the good old days. There's also some internal achievements you may want to gun for. Still, I would say maybe wait for a sale like 10 or 20% to truly get your money's worth. Before we get into my final thoughts, don't forget to hit that like button and that subscribe button for more awesome Switch content like this. Also leave a comment telling us what you think of Turok and if you'll get it or not. Overall, I think we have to face facts. Turok was an awesome game back in the day and one of the must-have titles for the Nintendo 64 because there was just so few games like this available. Plus, it had dinosaurs in it. Dinosaurs! It's not aged the best, however, and these days it's certainly more of a curiosity than a must-have title. Night Dive Studios have done a commendable job bringing it to modern consoles pretty much out of the blue, but it still feels like more could have been done since it plays pretty much how it always did, just slightly more tolerable. This Nintendo Switch release is still a fun time, but there is much better shooters currently out there on the Switch, so I would say that this is one of those that if you're looking for a bit of nostalgia or wanting to experience an important title in gaming history with the caveat of not expecting too much modern polish, then it's a good choice. Saying that, I dare anyone to play this game and tell me that they didn't find it charmingly enjoyable and satisfying. Go on, just try it. It's a 7 out of 10. If you're looking for a shooter with a bit of a bigger budget, then check out our review of Wolfenstein, or maybe a little more retro with Rogue Trooper Redux. Also, if you missed my short gameplay video, then maybe check that out too. I've been Jordan from SwitchWatch, and I'll see you guys over there.